Hello, this is Shawn Briscoe, and in this presentation I will discuss counterplans, a little bit about what counterplans are and how they're used in debates, the critical components or stock issues of counterplans using traditional debate theory, and the ways that affirmative teams can go about answering them as well. Just to put them into context of debate a little bit, originally policy debate started with all of the stock issues, and we used the judicial model of debate where the affirmative team had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the status quo was flawed. And you did that, like I said, by using the stock issues. You had to demonstrate a harm in the status quo. You had to show that that harm was in fact significant. You had to demonstrate the cause of the problem, present us with a topical plan, a plan that fell within the bounds of the debate topic or the resolution, and then show us that that plan would actually work. Eventually, debate shifted to legislative models of debate, where instead of using that judicial model of contention to prove guilt, we simply looked at cost-benefit analysis to determine whether or not the proposal put forth by the affirmative team, which fell within the boundaries of the resolution, led to more good or bad. In that model, it became less necessary for the affirmative to necessarily prove all of those stock issues, and instead we simply had debates about how significant the harms were, how effective the plan would be at solving it, but it also opened the door for unintended consequences, that being your disadvantages, showing the actual harms that would flow from passing the plan. I suppose you could also include in there case turns as well, showing that either the harm wasn't actually harm, it was a good thing, so the affirmative got rid of something that was actually beneficial, or instead of fixing the problem, they actually made it worse. Now, after some time, debaters came along and they said, you know, these aren't the only reasons why congressmen and women would choose to reject a proposed piece of legislation. You could also choose to reject it because you felt that there would be opportunity costs, that we would lose the opportunity to do something better if we pass your plan. So we should reject this piece of legislation or this plan because we could advocate for something that's better, and that is your counterplan. Now, the way that they are used in debate rounds can actually vary from the round. I've identified 6 of the primary ways in which we use counterplans in debates. Now, these are not hard and fast, strict interpretations of 6 separate types of counterplans. They're general categories, and in reality, oftentimes a counterplan will actually fall into multiple aspects of this breakdown. But I think that they're useful, or it's useful to think of counterplans in these 6 different ways so that we can start to think about how you might use a counterplan in a debate round, when it might be appropriate to use it in a debate round, and then also how to explain why that counterplan should win you the debate round if you are on the negative side of the resolution. So the first is the advantage-reducing counterplan. Really, an advantage-reducing counterplan is just looking at impact calculus. It's simply saying that you've given us a plan, I'm going to give you a different plan that I think is actually better or avoid some sort of a disadvantage. A lot of times debaters would use advantage-reducing counterplans when they would see an affirmative case that just had really big impacts and or the disadvantages that the negative team had were relatively small. Sometimes that would actually come up when, say, you were from a lay judge local circuit, where you had to have quote-unquote more realistic impacts, whereas you were at a national circuit tournament going up against debaters who were used to arguing nuclear war or extinction, and so you needed a way to allow your disadvantages to have some capability of enabling you to win the debate round. So you could run an advantage-reducing counterplan that would solve the affirmative problem to allow that smaller disadvantage to outweigh. You could also have a uniqueness-generating counterplan. This is when you would look at a disadvantage that you were running in the debate round and you realize or you recognize that there were problems with the disadvantage. Maybe you had difficulty proving that the disadvantage was actually unique, that now was a key time. And so you could run a counter, or maybe that we're already post the brink and we've got problems right now. And so you might run a counterplan which would resolve that error, would fix that error so that you would have a unique counterplan, assuming that the counterplan had actually been passed as legislation. You could have an alternate agent counterplan. This is simply testing the agent of action used by the affirmative team. That could be that the resolution specifically identifies the United States federal government as the agent of action, so perhaps you might have China, or the United Nations, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the World Trade Organization. Any of those agents could implement the affirmative policy instead, simply to test whether or not the U.S. federal government was the best actor. In some versions of alternate agent counterplans, you could even stay within the U.S. federal government, but choose a different agent of action than the one used by the affirmative team. Either way, you're still testing the choices of the affirmative team to determine whether or not that part of their plan, or that part of the resolution, is actually a good thing. A ban counterplan is a test of the solvency mechanism. In this example, you would actually outright ban the affirmative proposal. So for example, on an oceans debate topic, you might have an affirmative team which implements renewable energy in the ocean. So putting up wind farms in the ocean, using ocean thermal energy conversion and tidal power. Maybe the affirmative team then, or excuse me, the negative team wants to ban ocean-based renewable energy, but use terrestrial-based or land-based renewable energy instead. Wind power on land, geothermal power, solar power, etc. So you simply are banning the affirmative policies and replacing it with something else that would actually be non-topical. Now, why would you do that? Maybe you have really good disadvantages against the specific mechanisms spoken to by the resolution. Maybe you have good solvency attacks. And similar to the advantage reducing counterplan or showing the overlap between them, you also need to solve some of the harms that the affirmative is claiming if you want your disadvantages to actually be meaningful in the debate. And so you might choose to ban the mechanisms of the resolution and the affirmative team. An exclusionary counterplan is similar, but it's different in that instead of outright banning all of the affirmative mechanism, you exclude just a portion of it. And there are really two reasons why you would exclude a portion of the affirmative. In the first case, you've found some disadvantage links that are just on a specific aspect of the affirmative plan, for example. To go back to the ocean-based energy example, I mentioned OTEC, ocean thermal energy conversion, tidal power, and wind farms built out in the ocean. Maybe you have really good links to one of those three arguments, or one of those three sources of power. And so you then run a disadvantage that links to that specific renewable energy type, and then you have a counterplan which does everything but that single type. And then you would be testing the affirmative plan text in terms of whether or not they actually have chosen the best policy option. You could also use an exclusionary counterplan to test for topicality. Sometimes you'll go up against an affirmative team which is taking extra topical action, that they've included aspects of the plan text which reach beyond the resolution. And so sometimes negative teams would run a counterplan which excludes just that single piece of the resolution. So maybe they have a funding mechanism showing how they're going to pay for their plan, which of course makes it impossible for you to run a spending disadvantage because they're generating revenue in some way. But if that revenue generation is something that's beyond the scope of the resolution, then you might do the affirmative plan, excluding that funding mechanism, then run your spending disadvantage against them. And what that does for you, when the affirmative replies back and says that we don't link to the disadvantage because of the funding mechanism, and then on the counterplan itself they talk about abuse because you're just taking the affirmative case and you've left out this part and they're actually better because they avoid the disadvantage, that's when you can actually use then your counterplan not to win the round on cost-benefit analysis, but to bolster your topicality argument to show why that extra plank in the plan was actually harmful to you. And then finally, you can do a test of the topic counterplan. And that type of counterplan actually just serves to polarize the debate. And I know polarize is a little bit of a loaded term, so I don't want you to think that I mean polarizing things in the way that we think of it in politics. What I mean is you want to create a clear debate between the affirmative and the negative. Maybe you think there are some things about the affirmative which are similar to some aspects of the status quo, which is going to make the debate difficult to parse out. And so instead, you would simply give us the alternate worldview for your counterplan. So if, for example, the resolution is calling for us to subsidize private industry, you could polarize the debate by implementing a counterplan which bans subsidies of private industry. That way you have a world in which there are, on the affirmative, you're supporting subsidies, but in the negative worldview, there are never any subsidies. Or maybe the resolution is calling for the federal government to directly invest and have state-sponsored projects. Then you could polarize the debate by promoting private enterprise. Okay, that would be polarizing the debate, giving us two completely different worldviews, which can really be helpful in the storytelling to the judge in the later speeches of the round. And like I said, none of these are hard and fast separations. Oftentimes the counterplans that you come up with will incorporate multiple elements of these, but they are the 6 primary reasons why you would run a counterplan, and I think that can help you then to think of ways to run counterplans, like I said, in the middle of a round, and also in terms of how you use that counterplan as a storytelling device in the 2NR. Okay, so in the traditional worldview, counterplans had 4 stock issues. I am going to talk about primarily in the traditional worldview because I think that understanding where counterplans come from and the way we originally looked at them will help you to truly understand them so that you can create arguments in the present world. Now, I know that in contemporary debate, we oftentimes look at only 1 or 2 of these stock issues. But like I said, I think understanding the traditional worldview helps you to understand counterplans more fully, and then you can modify the stock issues later on using other strategies that we've talked about, primarily by examining things like fairness and education. And you can make arguments about why we should have all 4 stock issues, or maybe why we don't need any stock issues. So what are those 4 stock issues? Originally, counterplans had to do 4 things. They had to be a proposal which was non-topical, meaning outside the bounds of the resolution. The affirmative was limited to topical action, the counterplan is limited to non-topical action. The counterplan also had to be competitive. You could not do both the plan and the counterplan at the same time, and then you demonstrate that the counterplan is actually an opportunity cost of choosing the affirmative. Third, you had to demonstrate that the counterplan would solve the affirmative harm. Whatever the harm cited by the affirmative in their 1AC was, your counterplan also had to solve that harm. And then finally, you had to have some sort of a net benefit. And there's really multiple ways of having a net benefit. One, you could solve the harm better than the affirmative does. Therefore, you're at like affirmative solvency +1. You could have an additional advantage, or you could demonstrate a net benefit by avoiding a disadvantage. Now, why did we have all 4 of these stock issues? Well, all of them working together help us to divide ground between the affirmative and negative, but also help to limit what the negative's choices are so that the affirmative doesn't have to defend against the entire world. Because if you even think about non-topical as an example, simply saying that a counterplan has to be non-topical, then the only limit would be is that the negative team has to find one part of the resolution which they don't support. So they're either not the federal government or they're not one aspect of the solvency mechanism, which really means that the negative team still has an infinite choice for their counterplan case list. But the affirmative, that would be unfair to the affirmative because then they would have to do research against every single possible action in the world implemented by every single possible actor in the world. And so therefore we could focus the debate a little bit more by having some of these other stock issues so that there would be some sort of predictability, there would be some sort of limits to ensure that both teams have a fair chance to win, and then you also provide a little bit of focus. Having things like requiring the counterplan to solve the affirmative harms helps to focus and narrow the discussion to actions which are still related to the resolution, which helps us to get that topic-specific education of the resolution. Okay, so there's various reasons why we had these stock issues when counterplans first came about. So let's talk about some of them in turn. Topicality. Why did you have to be non-topical when you run a counterplan? I'm on the negative. Well, if the resolution is in existence to divide the affirmative and negative ground, then it only makes sense that the negative team would have to advocate for actions which fall outside the resolution. The status quo falls outside the resolution, right? Because the resolution says that the U.S. federal government should do something it's not currently doing now. That means any policy that is being done right now and relates to the resolution or doesn't relate to the resolution is actually still negative ground, right? So maintaining the existing structure is a non-topical policy. But you could also choose to do other plans that fall outside. And like I said, that helps us to divide ground and ensure fairness and predictability. But then we add in the level of competition, meaning that the plan and the counterplan cannot be done at the same time. And again, the purpose behind that is competition functions in much the same way that a link does on a disadvantage. When you run an argument and you're collapsing down to cost-benefit analysis, you need to be able to show that by choosing the proposal of the affirmative team, we cause something bad to happen. Well, the disadvantage, you show that there's a chain of events that goes into place. With a counterplan, you're saying that there is some other proposal out there which could be done, but if we pass your plan, we cannot do this counterplan. And my advocacy in the debate round is the counterplan. And you can demonstrate that competition in a number of different ways. There's actually more than the three that just popped up on the screen. But the strongest is simply to show that they are mutually exclusive, that there is something about those two plans which cannot be done together. So for example, when I gave the polarizing the debate, the test, the resolution, having a plan which subsidizes renewable energy and having a counterplan which bans all subsidies to renewable energy, those obviously cannot be done at the same time. They are mutually exclusive. And there's various different ways that you can demonstrate mutual exclusivity. But you could have philosophical competition, which might say that, yeah, we can't do both of these or we could do both of these policies at the same time, but they are approaching the issue from completely different philosophical perspectives, and that should be enough to reject. You could show that they use the same resources, that maybe there's a finite number of scientists to work on the plan and the counterplan, and so we can't actually do both of them at the same time. Like I said, there are other ways that you can demonstrate competition. What it really comes down to is you as a debater, when you craft a counterplan, you want to show why you cannot do both of them at the same time. So, let's talk a little bit about then how we go about refuting a counterplan. You're on the affirmative and the negative team has run a counterplan against you. What are the key ways that you can go about responding to it? And really, I think that there are three primary ways that teams refute counterplans. One is you can show that it is in fact a topical action, thereby providing a warrant for the resolution. You could attack the competitiveness level of the counterplan and show that it's not competitive and is therefore not a reason to reject your plan. And then you could simply engage in cost-benefit analysis. Look at the impacts. See which policy is going to lead to a better world. And if the judge is a policymaker, then that's all that really matters. Does the counterplan or the plan lead to more good in the world? So when you talk about topicality, again, think about why topicality exists for the affirmative, and then use those same ideas when running a topicality argument against the counterplan. If they've crafted a counterplan which falls within the bounds of the resolution, there are really three different ways that you can argue against the counterplan to say why that counterplan or why that team should be rejected. One is simply a division of ground. It's a rule of the game. The affirmative is limited to topical action. The negative team is limited to non-topical action. They violated a rule, they should lose. Now remember, most modern judges do not find that very compelling, however. They want to know why these rules of the game should exist, which brings us to the next two ways to argue why topicality matters. That this is a game, and both participants in the game should have a fair opportunity to win, or an equal opportunity to win. And so limiting the scope of choices that the negative team has generates fairness. It ensures that both the affirmative and the negative have an opportunity to win. But then you could also demonstrate education and say that by limiting them to non-topical actions rather than proving a topical action, that we would get a better education about why the resolution is a good idea or not a good idea. I do throw in a fiat limitations argument, and I mostly associated with topicality here just because of it being partially a kind of a rule of the game discussion. But there are different thoughts on whether or not there are limitations to what types of actions or the types of actors that counterplans can use. The limited worldview of fiat says that the negative team should have an equivalent amount of ability to fiat that the affirmative does. So if the affirmative is limited to a single agent of action, then the negative should be limited to a single agent of action. They should not have the added benefit of being able to have control over multiple national actors, or to take it to its logical extreme, if you could fiat at any level you want, they could just say fiat all 6 billion people in the world will do X, right? If you give the negative team the opportunity to expand out and fiat multiple agents of action, then the negative is always going to win. So this view of fiat limitations helps to ensure fairness in the debate. But there is also the unlimited worldview of fiat limitations on the counterplan, and that says that anything outside the bounds of the resolution is fair game to the negative. Meaning, hey, if it's non-topical, I can do it. Again, that might mean that they get an unfair advantage, but if the debate is all about testing the resolution itself to see if it's a good idea or if there's something better out there, then why wouldn't the negative have the opportunity to reach out beyond that equivalent level of fiat power? And again, you can get into debates about fairness and education to determine whether or not the negative team should be limited in its scope. Also, answering the competition. You can directly refute the analysis on the counterplan, explaining how the counterplan is competitive. Just go into the analysis and explain why that doesn't compete, why the counterplan can be done at the same time. That can be especially useful for you in current debates, because a lot of teams have gotten rid of this idea of competition using a pure policymaker analysis. Debaters have started to look at competition as simply an evaluation of which policy is better. And so they've said, hey, if you link to a disadvantage and I avoid it, then that's the competition, because a logical, rational policymaker would never choose to implement a course of action which would lead to a bad thing. But you could go after that and say, well, no, that proves a net benefit, but it doesn't demonstrate why I would lose the opportunity to do your case. You're mixing stock issues. You're mixing the ability to parse out whether or not there's an opportunity cost and then evaluate the net benefit standard and look at whether or not that's a true story or not. But in addition to providing that direct refutation, you could also offer a permutation or a perm, which is simply a test of the competition. You would simply give the judge and your opponents a statement that says, perm, do both. Do my plan and their plan at the same time. So if they have chosen to implement land-based renewable energy and your ocean-based renewable energy, just say, perm, do ocean and land-based renewable energy. Now, obviously, you couldn't do that in the 1AC because that would have a lot of action that is outside the bounds of the resolution if it's an ocean-based topic, right? And so you couldn't craft that into the 1AC. But if your opponents are simply saying, hey, we're going to do a counterplan that does this stuff, then you could say, perm, do both. And you would tell the judge what that would look like. Now, again, that's a test of competition. It's not a change in advocacy. You're not actually telling the judge that we're rewriting our plan text. We're amending our plan text. You're showing that it would be possible to do both. So we could pass our plan with an amendment that would include that, or we could pass our plan and then tomorrow we could pass the counterplan. Either way would be sufficient, and you would show then that it isn't an opportunity cost, right? And those sort of perms can also be really useful when you have people who just come up with a counterplan that's like, hey, this would be a great idea, but it's not related to your case at all. So it doesn't disprove anything about your case. It doesn't clash with your case. And then finally, answering the impacts. Go into the counterplan itself and evaluate its solvency story. Does it actually provide the opportunity to solve? And really, just think about this in the same way that you would answer an affirmative case. You know how to answer an affirmative case and evaluate the solvency stories on a 1AC, so do the same thing on the counterplan. Evaluate its ability to solve. When they're running disadvantages and critiques as net benefits to the counterplan, make sure that they tell a story that explains why they can avoid that disadvantage or that critique. Make sure that you're examining the solvency story of avoiding those harms, more or less, right? You can also run disadvantages and critiques against a counterplan. Just make sure that those disadvantages and critiques don't link to your case, don't link to your plan. But you could absolutely run disadvantages and critiques against the counterplan. And I guess I left off earlier on the solvency stories. You could also run case turns against the counterplan, showing how they actually make the problem worse. And then in the end, you're simply using cost-benefit analysis. Like I talked about in an earlier presentation, evaluate the impact calculus through magnitude, through time frames, probability, all of those things that we talked about in my earlier presentations. You could do that against the counterplan as well to explain why your plan outweighs the counterplan, or if you're on the negative, why the counterplan outweighs the AF.